See, all of us are in the same boat, and that's this. All of us have willfully chosen to do wrong. All of us have willfully chosen to alienate ourselves from God. And all of us were also born alienated. You know, here a baby that no one really wanted, no one was really expecting, and no one was really praying for, made all the difference in the world in their family. They couldn't imagine a world without that one 5 years later. And we can't imagine a world, what our world would have been like without a baby that no one was looking for or expecting or praying for 2,000 years ago. Before we get to the sermon, I do want to congratulate you on one thing. You know, one of the things we've done, we started about 10, 11 years ago. I don't even know when we started. It started with humble beginnings. You know, there's a few people in here that know what it's like to be in a small town, far from home, and you're pastoring a church, and maybe you're young, you're just starting out, and it seems like no one is standing there with you and no one has your back, and you're feeling really abandoned. And I've just been reading this week that this Christmas especially, we have drug overdoses are at an all-time high, suicides are at an all-time high. All this isolation is causing issues, and sometimes we have these small churches and people doing the best job they can. I want you to know that this church gave, are you ready? Over $2,600 this year. And there was one gift that deposited $1,000 into an Amazon gift card. And so I've been talking to about 5 or 6 pastors who are just kind of starting out. They're young, they're in small churches, and I've got to call them in the last couple of days and say, I want you to go to Amazon and I want you to find about $150 worth of books that you've been wanting. And give me that list and I'll have them delivered to your house. And that's been fun conversation. And one of the pastors that got a check, it's on my cell phone, said, we opened the card and my wife and I almost passed out. We have no idea why we were chosen to get this gift, but we want to thank you and your wonderful church from the bottom of our heart. Merry Christmas. And I wanted you to know that we've already received that, and thank you. In the midst of this, all the stuff's going on, just out of this kindness, this will continue to have echo and ripple effects for a couple generations to come. And I just wanted to stop and say thank you. We're in the middle of Paul looking at Christmas. And reading out of Romans chapter 5, starting with verse 6. And Paul writing and says this: You see, at just the right time, while we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous man, though for a good man someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates His own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we now have been justified by His blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through Him? For if, when we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to Him through the death of His Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through His life? Not only is this so, but we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we now have received reconciliation. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, in this way death came to all men, because all of us have sinned. For before the law was given, sin was in the world, but sin is not taken into account when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking a command, as did Adam, who was a pattern of the one to come. But the gift is not like the trespass. For if the many died by the trespass of the one man, how much more did God's grace and the gift that came by that grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, overflow to the many? The topic I want to talk about this morning is who are the recipients of this gift that came at Christmas? The first group is the powerless. We think of that term powerless, and we think people don't have any political influence, which is probably most of us, if not all of us. We think people don't have any wealth, don't have a lot of stuff. Those distinctions shouldn't matter ever in the church anyway. But that's really what Paul was talking about when he says powerless. All of us, none of us have the ability to save ourselves. Every one of us are born deeply, deeply flawed. And it's all different. Some of us might have a problem with gossip, some pride, some lust, some selfishness, some greed. We might not all share all of these, but we all have one. What we all have in common is we're all born so deeply flawed is we have the inability to close that gap between God and ourselves on our own. What the church has taught for 2,000 years is that before any of us ever had a thought of reaching to God, God has reached down to us. That's grace. We don't wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm going to respond, and I'm going to respond to God's voice. No, we hear God's voice first. And the thing that started off this whole cycle of God reaching for us is Jesus coming to Bethlehem. That was his first attempt to reach down into our lives. So all of us approach God from the same deficient state. We need grace first. We need to hear. We need to be empowered to even react, to respond to God's voice. God reaches to us before we reach to God. So, Christmas is for the powerless. There's a second group, and that is those that are oppressed. Boy, we've made that out to be something different in today's political climate. Today is a race. Everybody's engaged in a race to see who can be the biggest victim. You think you're a victim? Let me tell you about me. I'm a bigger victim than you. We seem to amass power. We seem to amass points by proving who can be the biggest victim. Boy, that's a perversion of the gospel message. All of us, at some level, are oppressed. Some of us more impacted than others. Some of us had the privilege of growing up in these wonderful homes where you had these godly people in your life. You were loved, you were affirmed, you were accepted, you were embraced, you were encouraged. And some of us didn't have that environment at all. I know it's not fair. And so we think that some of us are more deserving of grace than others. Look at that person over there. They do that. I know better than to do that. Well, some of us are born maybe just a little more deeply impacted than others. Men's breakfast yesterday, we were talking about Christmas memories we have. What were the most impactful Christmas memories? And even in that room, there's like 13 of us there. Some were thinking about, at our house growing up, the tree was always here, and the gifts were always here, and the stocking was always here. And we have these very specific memories. And others of us, my goodness, we moved every other year, every 18 months. And so there is no one memory because we grew up in 8 different houses. As I was thinking about that, I have, half my Christmases were with Mom, half the Christmases were with Dad. The ones that were with Mom, half of those we drove to Minnesota. Half the ones with Dad were with whatever wife's family he was with at the time. And so I don't have a Christmas memory. There were all these different houses and all these different places and all these different times. See, all of us are in the same boat, and that's this. All of us have willfully chosen to do wrong. All of us have willfully chosen to alienate ourselves from God. And all of us were also born alienated. It is a true statement that we all are guilty of sin, and we're all victims of sin at the same time. It's both. And yet most of our churches through most of our lives, all we've heard about is how we're guilty of it. And that's true. But from God's perspective, Paul and Galatians say we're imprisoned by it. What Christ did, he came to free us from the thing that we're victims of. There are times in our life where we have slept in the bed that we've made for ourselves. And other times we sleep in the bed that was maybe made deficiently for us. Christ came to liberate us from both. And to maybe live more and more free from those things that imprison us. You know, if I have a bad temper, that anger is going to limit my possibilities. That anger is going to alienate me from the people around us. If I'm prideful, same thing. We try to be free from those effects. The good news is that we can come to Christ, we can start a new life at a moment's time. And then it starts a life of maturing and growth where we become more and more and more and more like Christ. Some of you already know this. But 34 years ago today, I married my wife. At about 1:30, I think, in the afternoon, if I'm correct. My wife is wearing red. Normally she wears black today. This is an improvement for her. 34 years ago. And what reminded me of it is yesterday it was cloudy and gray all day, and it was dry, about 40 degrees. It was a carbon copy of the day we got married. At that 1:30 in the afternoon, 34 years ago, 2 seconds after I said I do, I was married. 10 minutes earlier I wasn't. I was then. However, there's been 34 years of growth. 34 years. I'd like to think that the marriage is better now. I'd like to think there's more understanding now. I'd like to think there's a deeper level of trust and love and grace and all those other things. It's the same way with Christ. We come to Christ in a moment. And then we grow from there. I was just as much a Christian after I asked Jesus into my heart at age 7 as I am right now. But boy, I'd like to think there's 49 years of difference along the way. So yes, he came for the powerless. He came for the oppressed. The next group he came for is the estranged. I didn't say the strange. The estranged. We are all estranged from other people. As I said before, we let our pride, our anger, our selfishness kind of get in the way of relationships. We also, I think, as we let sin into our life, we get estranged from ourselves. Sin involves an inward turn. I think we go through life, I think we have a couple different choices. We can either grow narrow and we can get harder and grow colder, or we can soften and broaden and grow more graceful. One of the most impactful conversations I had was one of the last times I saw my grandmother's at her kitchen table. And she said, "Doug, let me tell you what God's been telling me in my devotions." She said, "I'm always more and more and more aware of just how far short I fall." And if you knew her life, that's a statement. We can grow to where we're unable to hear the still small voice. We're so used to being hard, so used to turning away from it, so used to being selfish, so used to being cold, we don't even hear it anymore. And so the last bit of estrangement is we become estranged from God. We do not easily or naturally follow God's voice at all in our lives. We're too impacted. And we willfully further that gap with our choices. One of the great signs of maturity that a lot of people have is no matter how we think we're impacted, and mom forgot my 8th birthday, and dad wasn't nice to me, and they made me clean my room, and all the stuff we complain about, is when we get to the point of life when we say, the problem is me, and I need grace. Each time we ignore God, each time we put God off, it becomes easier and easier and easier to do it again. And so if Christmas is for the powerless, if Christmas is for the estranged, if Christmas is for the oppressed, it's also for anyone who desires new life. Paul claims that death was in control because of sin. Sin creates physical death. We know that. You drink too much, you're physically impacted. Take drugs, it ruins life. You eat a double cheeseburger all the time, you're shortening your life. You decide to not exercise, you're shortening your life. You get stressed, that shortens your life. Sin also creates relational death. We get too prideful. We get too selfish. We get too angry. We get too lustful. It impacts those closest to us. It hurts our marriages. It hurts our family life. It hurts the relationships we have with our kids. You know, it's true. We all know that if you exercise, you live longer. We all know if you eat right, you live longer. We all know if there's certain things you avoid, you live longer. You know, we also know people who are happily married live longer. People who have good relations with other people, they live longer. People that pray regularly live longer. These are all facts. People who go to church regularly live longer. I'm not saying that because I'm a pastor. I'm saying that because I read the paper. Sin slowly kills me, all of us, from the inside out. And it's a slow drift. And pretty soon, you're not heading in the way you thought. You've heard stories of people who are lost, maybe on a hike, and they hike for days trying to find their way out. And they end up finding out that they were slowly going in a circle. If any of you have ever been out in the middle of Lake Michigan or Lake Erie or someone else in a boat, unless your compass is good, there's no marker to really know where you're going. You can kind of slowly go in a circle or drift aimlessly. The problem with sin is it turns me inward. It hardens my heart. It reduces love and empathy. And I just kind of drift. And I find myself in a place I never thought I'd be. The world was at a place it never thought it'd be. And 2,000 years ago, the first act to change everything was God coming to earth and walking among us. Jesus said in the Gospel of John, I've come that you might have life and have it to the full. And that's what God wants for all of us. If God would have come as a king or a ruler or Caesar or a leader, then even the hard-hearted would have noticed his arrival. If he'd have came as a powerful military victor, one would notice without love, without empathy, without grace. But when you have to look in a manger, when one has to look for God carefully, and one has to look for a star that one might not readily see, well, maybe you have to look. When one dies on a cross, then even those who are marginalized might notice that kind of death. That new life that Jesus said he came to start in all of us started in a manger. And it was geared for everyone, not just those with money, not just those with political influence, not just those who had every benefit of family, but for everyone. Paul noticed, hope we do too, Christmas this week.